Okay, welcome to week two's lecture on cognitive neuroscience. This week there are three main things that I would like to focus on. We're going to talk about some very basic neuroanatomy, so understanding the fact that we have different regions of the brain, and these different regions are often associated with unique or different functions. We're going to look at some neuroscience methods. So if you're a cognitive psychologist or a cognitive neuroscientist, what are the kind of tools and the methods that you have for looking into and understanding which regions of the brain are active or responsible for when we're engaged in particular processes? And finally, we're going to look at what we can learn through studying patients with brain disorders. So if you had somebody that suffered a traumatic brain injury, so for example a hit to the skull, or they've had a stroke, what can we learn about the healthy, normal functioning brain by understanding the difficulties that these patients might have? Okay, so this is the brain. More precisely, this is a side-on profile view of the brain illustrating the cerebral cortex. And the cerebral cortex is an outer layer of folded grey matter, relatively thin, so this ranges between 1 and 3 millimeters in thickness, and this is the most highly developed part of the human brain. And it's also the region that's responsible for a wide range of cognitive processes, so most information processing occurs in the cerebral cortex. Hence the reason we're going to focus most of our attention on this. This is where a lot of cognitive psychology is relevant. Now, the cerebral cortex is divided into 4 lobes that each have somewhat overlapping but also specific and unique functions. There is a frontal, temporal, parietal and occipital lobe. Now I've also marked on here at the bottom right hand side the cerebellum, just in case you're looking at this wondering what the stripy region is at the bottom. There's very few times throughout this course where I'm actually going to discuss the cerebellum, but it's actually an incredibly important part of the brain, and especially involved in helping us to be able to adapt to our environment. So despite the fact there's not much literature in the textbook, I'll try and introduce the cerebellum where opportunities allow. Now, I've just mentioned the cortex, or this grey matter, is not some kind of flat sheet that wraps nicely around the brain. Rather, it's a series of folds that are kind of wound back amongst itself. Now, more technically, we refer to the bumps and dips as gyri and sulci. So you have these elevated ridges or bumps that come out that are known as a gyrus. The parts where the cortex folds in to produce a small groove is called a sulcus. Now, dividing those 4 major lobes that we've just talked about, there are especially deep sulci, so also known as fissures. So for example, you have a central sulcus that runs almost vertically, dividing the frontal and the parietal lobe. And then you have a lateral sulcus that runs almost horizontal, marking the boundary of the temporal lobe. So what divides the temporal lobe from both the parietal and the frontal lobe? Now this lateral sulcus is also known as the Sylvian fissure. You don't need to know the reason why. Now I want you at this point just to have a think about why it would be useful to have the cortex comprised of these ridges, rather than it just being flat. So what, in a kind of evolutionary sense, why would that potentially be adaptive? Now pause the video, have a think, and see if you can come up with an answer. Okay, I trust that you paused the video. Put simply, one of the reasons is that having this sulci and the gyri are simply a way of being able to increase the surface area of the cerebral cortex, and therefore also increasing the number of neurons that you can fit in. And you can do this if you have it wound around without needing to greatly expand the size of the skull. So in other words, it's our kind of mechanism for getting as many neurons or as much processing power in as possible without needing a necessarily huge, massive skull to contain this within. So dividing the cerebral cortex into these 4 lobes is one way of viewing things. However, it isn't the only way that you can divide things up. And one early attempt that still has a lot of relevance is a map of the cerebral cortex by the German neurologist Corbinian Brodmann. And the map below presents the segregation of the cerebral cortex into multiple different areas. Now, he started off with 43. There's more than that are indicated in this architecture. And these different regions were identified based on the fact that he used cell body stained histological sections. So in other words, Corbinian would take a microscope, he would take brains that had been donated, let's assume they're donated from people who had passed away, and he's taking each of the different sections of the cerebral cortex and closely examining them under the microscope, and basically looking for each of those regions. What's the positioning of the cells? What's the size of the neurons there? What kind of density and distribution do these cells have? And he would distinguish between these regions based on whether they differ in terms of the architecture of the cells that are presented there. And 100 years later, we're 109 years later at the moment, a large number of neuroscientists still use Brodmann's map for localizing neuroimaging data that's been obtained on the human brain. So the image that's presented here is his earliest map from 1909. You see as science goes through, there's progressions of how this map develops. But one example on here, if you look at the region the most posterior on the occipital lobe, know where that is? You will find Brodmann's area 17, so BA17, and this corresponds to what is also called the primary visual cortex, or V1. We'll come on to that soon. As cognitive psychologists, we like to be very precise about the terminology that we use to describe where regions are located in the brain relative to each other, and these terms can be used somewhat interchangeably. So it's not going to be essential that you know where each of these terms refer to, but it is going to help your understanding throughout the course. So if I refer to something as being dorsal, then being able to understand that that means on the top or superior is going to be useful for your own representation. So dorsal, superior, top. Ventral, in other words, something that is inferior or towards the bottom. Anterior is towards the front. Posterior, towards the back. If we refer to things that are lateral, they're towards the side, and medial is towards the middle. I'm sure there's a pretty good song and dance that could go with that one, but hey, I'll let you do the moves. So one thing that will become important is the idea that we have these different regions of the cortex that are implicated in different functions. So for example, the occipital cortex is really strongly implicated in vision or visual processing, whereas you might have regions of the frontal lobe that are much more strongly associated in higher order executive functions. So for example, if you're trying to do some problem solving, or you're trying to direct your attention to particular stimuli, or to this video right now and not the other distractions that are around you. Another example might be regions of the temporal lobe are implicated in just being able to understand and process the language that you're hearing when I talk right now. But it's important to also note that when doing any sort of process, there are usually multiple regions of the brain that are involved. And there's not just one of these. There's not just one of these regions that are implicated. So for example, whilst I might say that a specific region of the brain is associated with, say, the ability to read. However, the actual process of reading is not just going to require that one region, it's going to require a real kind of integration of various parts of the brain working together. So more like a kind of coordinated orchestra that's working there. But there might be one region that is kind of key in integrating all of this information. So again, if we look at the example of reading, you might have the temporal lobe that's responsible for phonological awareness, so processing phonemes and input of sounds. But you also have the frontal lobe, which handles speech production, reading fluency, grammatical usage, and aspects of comprehension. We then have semantic memory, so our understanding of the knowledge of words that we're hearing needs to be activated to actually make sense of what we're listening to. And then you have regions such as the angular and supramarginal gyrus, which serve as a kind of reading integrator that links together all of this information. So again, in this example of reading, multiple things that are necessary in order to actually be able to read. So let's go through and just get a little bit of understanding of what some of the basic functions of the lobes are. So the frontal lobe, unsurprisingly, located towards the front of the brain, is associated with motor processing, higher thought processes such as abstract reasoning, problem solving, planning, judgment. It's also strongly implicated in emotions. So if you haven't come across it already, in one of your courses, you'll be introduced to the case of Phineas Gage. This is somebody who had a tamping rod that went through the prefrontal cortex, so part of the frontal lobe, and fundamentally changed who he was. So he changed his emotional responses and his behaviors, implicating the fact that the frontal lobe must have some role in these kind of aspects that are kind of core to ourselves, such as emotions. Executive functions include decision-making, reasoning, inhibition. So your ability to exert a degree of control over the behaviors. So to make you do the things that you want to do and not just constantly react impulsively. Now, the parietal lobe is at the upper kind of back posterior portion of the brain, and this is associated with somatosensory processing. It receives various inputs regarding touch, pain, temperature, and other senses. You have regions of the parietal lobe also will integrate an understanding of where your limbs are in space. So this is something that typically we don't do at a conscious level. It's not something you're aware of, but we're constantly processing and understanding of exactly where our arms and our feet are in space and relative to other objects that are in the environment around us, something that is known as proprioception. If you take away, and there's case studies of patients who don't have any ability in proprioception, if you take this away, a lot of the time people will just collapse down in a kind of lump, basically. If you're not aware where your feet are in space, you're not able to regulate how your muscles should be responding to either keep you sitting down or standing up appropriately. The parietal lobe is also involved in aspects of consciousness and paying attention. So if you're paying attention to what you're reading right now, hopefully your parietal lobe should be activated. And you can see you have this kind of strip that runs down right next to the postcentral gyrus that has this primary somatosensory cortex that's there, along with the gustatory cortex, which is involved in taste sensation. Okay, the occipital lobe is associated with visual processing, and it contains numerous visual areas. The most important of these is V1, or this primary visual cortex. This is the most posterior region, so right at the back of the occipital lobe. As you should remember, it's BA Brodmer's area 17. This receives input from the retina. So when you get information coming in through the retina that goes to the optic nerve via the thalamus, this finally finds its way back to V1. And within V1, this visual information is represented or transformed into a retinotopic map. So this retinotopic map is almost like a kind of one-to-one mapping of neurons that will fire in V1 to recreate or represent the visual stimuli that's there. So a very simple example might be if you're looking at a dark cross that's being presented in front of you. If you're looking at that sort of stimuli and then you think of the neurons that would be firing in V1, the neurons would fire in a pattern that maps onto that similar sort of cross. Now, things get a little bit more complicated than this in the fact that the retinotopic map is inverted and flipped around, so it never truly represents exactly what you're seeing, but there's still a one-to-one mapping that's going on there. And then we have other visual association areas that interpret additional information such as the sort of aspects of motion or color or aspects of form of the visual scene. Finally, the temporal lobe is a region that's associated with auditory, olfactory processing, and comprehending language. It also has a role in some visual memories. So the Wernicke's area is one of the most important regions within this, and it's classically, so there's always some dispute over exactly where it's located, but it's classically located in the posterior section of the superior temporal gyrus, and typically also in the left cerebral hemisphere. And this area encircles the region of the auditory cortex on the lateral sulcus, so the part of the brain where the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe meet. And this region is responsible for language comprehension. So it makes sense that it should be in a region that's kind of nicely integrating these different processes. So you also see a little bit more clearly on here, you have the auditory cortex, Wernicke's area, and the exact location of the olfactory cortex. Okay, so that's the basics of the cerebral cortex. One of the region or collection of brain regions that is important is the limbic system. And this is a part of the brain that's involved in our behavioral and emotional responses. So especially when it comes to behaviors that we need for survival. So kind of feeding, reproduction, caring for our young, and this sort of fight or flight response that we can show. And you can find the structures of the limbic system buried deep within the brain. So this is underneath the cerebral cortex and above the lower order regions of the brainstem. So the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the basal ganglia are also involved in actions of the limbic system. But the two of the major structures are the hippocampus and the amygdala. So the hippocampus, like many other structures in the brain, comes as a pair. So there's one on the right, one on the left hemisphere. It resembles the shape of a curvy seahorse. You need a little bit of imagination for this, hence the reason it gets its name. So hippocampus is the Latin scientific genus for seahorse. And this is essentially the memory center of our brains. So here, our episodic memories are formed and catalogued, ready to be filed away into long-term storage across other parts of the cerebral cortex. And we have connections made in the hippocampus that help us to associate memories with various scenes. There's also a lot of work showing that the hippocampus is very important for spatial orientation and our ability to navigate the world. And the hippocampus is one site in the brain where new neurons are actually made from adult stem cells. The amygdala, this gets its name from the fact that it is a kind of almond-like shape. So this is located right next to the hippocampus, and the left and the right amygdala play a central role in our emotional responses, including feelings like pleasure, fear, anxiety, and anger. And the amygdala also attaches emotional content to our memories. So it plays an important role in determining how robustly the memories that we have are stored. So things that have a kind of strong emotional meaning to them tend to oftentimes be the memories that stick the strongest.